Now, to offer some insight into the US position on the commercial passenger plane attack in the Russian-occupied area of Ukraine, we're joined now by Tom Switzer. He's a research associate with the US Studies Centre. Tom Switzer, what do you make of the reaction from the United States authorities so far to this?
Well, I think on the whole, the Obama administration has been measured and cautious in its public statements. It's not quick to, it's been very hesitant to apportion blame, and I think that there is a sense that there is no need to point fingers so early in the piece. That said, there is a strong underlying feeling in Washington that the culprits here are the Russian separatists, and they've been egged on by the Russian government. And once it's established the cause of this terrible incident, then I suspect that the administration will then need to make some very serious policy proposals about how it responds to Russia's aggression.
What do you think the US administration needs to do?
Well, opinion is divided. I think that the Obama administration so far throughout this crisis, since the downfall of the Yanukovych government in Kiev in February, has had a mixed position. On the one hand, it has made it quite clear to Putin that the incursion into Crimea in March was illegal. There have been targeted sanctions against Russian industry and Russian financiers. But on the other hand, the Obama administration has been reluctant to extend NATO security guarantees to Ukraine, which of course Russia would see as tantamount to infringing on what it sees as its sphere of influence. So I think the Obama administration is caught in a bind here. One thing you do have to remember is that the American people, the American lawmakers that make up Congress, and most leading political figures are suffering from foreign policy fatigue. You know, they're tired of the world after the mistakes made in Afghanistan and Iraq. There is a non-interventionist, discriminatory mood, a reordering of priorities at home. And the last thing the American people are hankering for is a new Cold War with its old Cold War nemesis.
That might be the case, but there has been a lot of criticism from both Democrats and Republicans that the president has been weak, whether it comes to the situation in Syria, Iraq, and of course now particularly in Ukraine.
Well, bear in mind that the Obama administration has taken a more hawkish approach towards Russia since the crisis brewed in February. Many Western European countries that make up the US NATO alliance members have been far more cautious, and that's largely because many of the countries, most notably Germany, are heavily tied to Russia when it comes to energy reserves and trade deals. So one of the problems the administration will face now is, if it is serious about punishing the Putin government, if it is indeed the culprit behind this in terms of aiding the Russian insurgencies, is how will it encourage the NATO allies to stiffen their spine to impose new, more stringent sanctions on Moscow. It's not altogether how that will play out. And of course the other calculation that's weighing on Washington's mind is, what does this mean for the West's relations with Ukraine? Does the European Union extend more economic ties to Ukraine? Do the Americans start to take seriously the idea of giving NATO security alliance obligations to Kiev? Bear in mind the Russians from the outset have been upset with NATO expansion since the mid to late 1990s. They see this as the taproot of the crisis, the Western incursion in what Russia sees as a sphere of influence. Get out of my space, get out of my face is what Putin's saying. And that's really the subtext to this crisis today. Russia is very nervous about Ukraine being out of the eastern orbit and in the western orbit, and that is the context for this crisis.
Now, Tom Switzer, you have said that you don't want to overstate it, but this could be the next Cuban Missile Crisis. What do you mean by that?
It's a minority view, admittedly, but Stephen Cohen, one of the most distinguished American experts on US-Russian relations, he was an advisor to President George H.W. Bush. He makes the case that we are 2 stages away from the Cuban Missile Crisis. These things can get quickly out of hand. Accidents, miscalculations, and remember, we're dealing here with Russia. Yes, it's a declining great power, but remember, it still has a huge arsenal of nuclear weapons. And if made desperate and humiliated further, it could react in the way that a dangerous animal could react. And I think that's on the mind of some of the more cautious members of the Obama administration. Of course, on the other hand, there's a very hawkish wing in Washington led by the likes of the former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who overnight spoke to the Charlie Rose show, and she spoke a more hawkish, belligerent language. And in many respects, Clinton reflects the spirit of the times. People are sick to death of Russia throwing its weight around in Ukraine, but some members of the former Bush administration, George H.W. Bush administration, see that what's happened with US-Russian relations over the last 20-25 years has been a repudiation of the implicit agreements reached between President Bush Sr. and President Gorbachev in the early 1990s, that in exchange for a reunified Germany as part of NATO, the West would not go east. And the Russians, I think with some justification, feel that their sensibilities are not being respected in the current crisis.
Tom Switzer from the US Studies Centre, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Kim.